It is 5 o'clock, so welcome to the July 6th, 2020 meeting of the Transportation Policy and Planning Board. For our first item, the clerk will do a roll call.
Baltazar and Santana.
I'm here.
Thank you. Chris McCahill.
Here.
Eric Sundquist.
Here.
Grant Foster.
Here.
Keith Berman.
Present.
Rebecca Kemble.
Here.
Robert Burke.
Present.
Tom Wilson.
Present.
Margaret Bergamini. Badri Lankella. Okay.
Thank you, Anne. Then I think we'll do our typical IT presentation, real brief. Are we still doing that, Jesse?
All right. Members, if you are able, please activate your video and keep it up for the duration of the meeting. Staff, if you are able, please activate your video when you are speaking. Use a raise hand feature when you'd like to be recognized to speak, ask questions, or request a roll call vote. Staff raise hand when you are asked a question. The chair will do their best to call on committee members in order in which their hands are raised. Lowering your hand will take you out of the queue. Members of the public who are registered to speak, the name you entered in Zoom must match the name you entered in registration. You will remain muted until called upon. The clerk will tell you when your time is up. After speaking, a member of the body may ask you a question. If you need to share documentation with the board, please send it to the email listed on today's agenda. Chair, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jesse. So members of the board, we will operate the same way we did last time. So it'll be up to you to mute and unmute yourself. So please pay attention to that. All votes will be voice vote unless it's very clear that there's differing opinions, and we will do a roll call vote. All right, so our next item then is...
Tom, can I just say before we move on that
go ahead, Ann.
Margaret Bergamini and Badri Lankella have now joined the meeting.
Thank you, Ann. All right, next item is the approval of minutes from the June 15th, 2020 meeting. Is there a motion to approve? I'm sorry, has everyone had a chance to review the minutes?
Yes.
Okay, is there a motion to approve?
This is Robert Burke. I would make the motion to approve.
Moved by Robert, is there a second?
A second, Badri.
Second by Badri. Any discussion? Use the hand raise feature. Seeing none, please unmute yourselves. All those in favor of approving last month's minutes, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye. Aye.
Opposed, no. Passes unanimously. Next item, I believe we have at least one registrant for comment for items not on the agenda. Is that correct, Anne?
Correct.
Okay, and I think the registrant is Bob Schaefer, 6 Cottonwood Circle, Madison, Wisconsin, 53704. Bob, I think you are on. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so you've got 3 minutes. You may begin when you're ready.
Okay. Just wanted to give the committee on the board an update on Transit X that got some new information from Transit X that I'm working with them right now to review everything, to submit it. It does cover things like retraining of current employees, some other job opportunities that might exist with that, other benefits that might be there for the city. And so I just wanted to give you an update on that and let you know that I will be getting that to the board, shortly.
Thank you, Mr. Schaefer. Are there any questions for the speaker? Seeing none, thank you again, Mr. Schaefer. All right, disclosures and recusals. Are there any communications, disclosures, or recusals from members of the board? Please use the hand raise feature. Seeing none, we will move on to our first item, Legistar 60922, adopting and endorsing a Vision Zero policy to eliminate fatalities and serious injuries that are a result of crashes on streets and paths within the city of Madison by 2030. Tom, is that going to be you?
Oh, I can. I have control of my own mute button. I feel power. No, actually, it'll be Yang Tao, and with Yang, I believe we also have Renee who can provide some additional information. So Yang, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, and thank you for unmuting me as well. And I'll share my screen for a very brief presentation. And as Tom mentioned that we also have a couple of other staff members here with me helping answer questions, Riley and Ali. But I want to start with thanking the board, for your long-time support for Vision Zero. Although today is the first time that this resolution is officially in front of the board, the board actually has been working on it for quite some time. There was quite some discussions, and also, the older members on the board helped us to draft the language for the resolution as well. But a few months ago, Mayor Sacha officially appointed a multi-agency staff team to develop and start a Vision Zero program for Madison. So the team has been working on it. We also get some support from Bloomberg Associates, which is a New York City management team. When Bloomberg was a mayor, after that, they formed a nonprofit to helping cities on different issues, and the Vision Zero is one of it. So very appreciate their support. The team has been, working on that. We have a weekly meeting. Then COVID-19 started, so we took a little pause and then we resumed. We have been debating whether this is a good time to move forward on this, but finally decided that it's probably better to move on this sooner rather than later. Even though this might not be a perfect time rolling this out, with all the other issues going on. But the team decided to introduce a couple of resolutions in front of the council in June. So this one is a main resolution to adopt and endorse a Vision Zero policy to eliminate fatalities and serious injuries that are a result of crashes on our streets and paths within the city of Madison by 2030. There is another resolution, which is the project list for 2020. And TPPB is the lead committee on the policy resolution, and the TC is the one on the project list resolution. So just briefly, in case some of the members maybe need to refresh your memory. So Vision Zero is a strategy to eliminate all traffic fatalities and serious injuries, while pay special attention to three things: safety, health, and also equity. It was first started in Sweden in 1990s, and then has become popular in Europe, and then some of the major cities in the States. So the map here shows some of those, all the cities that are currently officially Vision Zero city. There are a few major differences between Vision Zero and the traditional safety approach. Traditionally, we think that the traffic deaths are inevitable. It's just part of the system that we pay for our mobility. However, Vision Zero thinks that traffic deaths are largely preventable. And we used to demand perfect human behavior from our users. Vision Zero thinks that humans are just humans. We all make mistakes. But how can we integrate that human feeling in our design? That's that's a more important question. We traditionally focus on preventing collisions from happening, but Vision Zero think that maybe it's not important to prevent collisions. It's probably more important to prevent the bad results from the collisions, which are the fatal and the serious crashes. And we used to demand a lot of individual responsibilities from everyone in the system. But Vision Zero thinks that the system really has to work together. Let's take a systems approach. We also used to think that saving lives is expensive. Vision Zero thinks that saving lives may not be that expensive, and there are low-cost ways to do things. So we are, shifting our perspective from a sole engineer perspective to a public health perspective. Instead of asking why did that crash happen, we ask why was that person so seriously injured in that crash. So that's one of the biggest shift of thinking out there. There are a few key strategies that often deployed by Vision Zero. First, we need to build and sustain leadership, collaboration, and accountability, especially among a diverse group of stakeholders, not just transportation professionals, but also policymakers, public health officials, police, and very importantly, community members. Vision Zero is also very data focused. We need to collect, analyze, and use data to understand the trends and also potential disproportionate impacts of traffic death on certain populations. And as mentioned, Vision Zero prioritize equity, and as a result, community engagement is a very important component of it. Vision Zero also has a lot to do with managing speed, especially to safe levels. We all understand that different speeds can lead to different results. When you drive a lower speed, there is a much better chance for folks to survive or walk away with less injuries comparing to high speeds. That's especially true for pedestrians and bicycles. That's our roadway system. We also need to set a timeline to achieve zero traffic fatalities and serious injuries, which really brings a sense of urgency and accountability, and also ensure transparency on the progress and also on the challenges. I have to say that many people think that Vision Zero may not be ready to go. I think it's a hefty goal, and it's very difficult to achieve zero death and serious injuries. However, though, we did say that some success in other cities. For example, last year, Oslo, Norway got really close to zero death. They actually achieved zero death in pedestrians and bicyclists, and with very few amount of deaths involving motor vehicles. So that's definitely very encouraging. And also, even if we cannot totally reduce to zero, if we cut those traffic deaths and serious injuries by 50%, 70%, 80%, 90%, that's a lot of lives being saved. So, what makes a Vision Zero city? There is a Vision Zero network, mixed certification, and there are a few key components. The first, a city has to have a clear goal of eliminating traffic fatalities and serious injuries. And for us, we set a goal as 2030. So the mayor and all the city council has publicly, officially committed to Vision Zero, and that's what we're asking for now. And a Vision Zero plan or strategy has to be in place, or the mayor and the city council has committed to doing so in a clear time frame. So Vision Zero is also not just a transportation initiative. It also has to engage many key departments. So why we want to do that in Madison. The main reason is that traffic injuries and fatalities are a growing health concern for our community. So this graph shows the number of fatalities and severe injuries on our roadways and paths from 2013 to 2018 for those 6 years. We know that Madison is ranked highly on safety nationally. However, though, the numbers are still high. The blue one shows the number of persons in vehicles, and the bikes are red, and the gray ones are pedestrians. From this, we can also see that bikes and pedestrians, are definitely are disproportionately represented here. We don't have that high percentage of mode share, but ped and bike and ped almost accounted for like 30% of all our total crashes, total fatalities and injuries. So we just pay special attention on that. We have paid special attention to other deaths in our communities. For example, I think Tom often uses a very good example, which is very telling. That as when we compare our traffic fatalities to homicides in Madison, the numbers here are about the same. We got a lot of people pay a lot of attention, and we spend a lot of resources on crime prevention. But maybe it's time for us to step up on those traffic deaths as well. This map shows all the crash locations with injuries on our city streets from 2014-2018, the 5-year time period. We are working on analyzing the data, but we found some interesting things already. For example, 50% of fatal and critical injuries occur on just 4% of city streets. So there are hotspots that it makes sense for us to focus resources on to really make a change. So this is a city steering team, the mayor's office, traffic engineering, city engineering, police services, police department, metro transit, and public health. So this is the team, going to work with the mayor and the council to kind of steering the direction of the initiative. But we also have a plan to engage many stakeholders. We identify a long list of organizations. We want to set up a task force called the Stakeholder Task Force and get them involved in the process. A few things will come out pretty soon. As I mentioned, that we're also introducing a resolution for Vision Zero Advanced projects for this year. Actually, I want to thank our council, including all the others on this board, for giving traffic engineering some funds to do some projects this year. And we developed a list, and most of those are speed management projects with a limited amount of intersection treatment projects. We also reserved about $100,000 to work with a consultant to analyze our data and identify a few good projects to apply for some federal safety funding. Hopefully, we can get some of the funds and do some larger scale intersection improvement projects. We are working on a website for the initiative that should become live pretty soon. And we are also setting up an email list so that the folks can subscribe and be updated on the progress. We're still looking for a slogan. So we did get some help from a local communications firm helping us develop a Vision Zero logo, which you have seen throughout the presentation. But we're still looking for a slogan. So we presented a couple of final choices for Mayor Satya, and there's some concerns of those slogans might be lost, with COVID-19 and Black Lives Matters. So one consideration was one death is too many. Another one is zero deaths, zero excuses. But we're looking for a better one that make it stand out more. So if you have any ideas, please let us know. Staff is also developing informational brochure. We call it the Strategic Vision Plan. That's going to be rolled out with a potential press event. The idea of the brochure is that we want to provide some sample with a lot of good infographics, so that for the public can easily understand what's Vision Zero, why it's important, and how to get involved. So that's a 6-7 page document that we're working on right now. We are also setting up a few work groups to develop an action plan, which is a more detailed document that really sets direction for the next 10 years also. So right now we're working with 4 groups: safer streets, safe data, safe vehicles, and safe people. So there are quite a few departments involved in that process, and we look forward to have some of the involvement from the stakeholders as well. And finally, community engagement. We before COVID-19 hit us, we actually had a pretty ambitious plan to do a lot of community engagement. Because COVID-19 and many public events got canceled, that plan was put off a little bit. But we started to do a few of those. For example, we reached out to the university, Wisconsin DOT, as MPO. All of them expressed strong support for us, and we started to build those partnership. One area we want to do more is to really engage the community of users. The idea is to really create a safe culture for the area. So we feel like that, that's a really key component of the whole initiative, and we look forward to the opportunity to get more of those started. So that's with that. That's all I want to present, and we can answer any questions or take any comments.
Thanks, Yang. So we'll go to our public comments next. First up, Sean Koval, 3010 Gregory Street, Madison, Wisconsin. Sean, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Tom, can you hear me?
I can. So you have 3 minutes. Go ahead.
Great. I don't think I'll need all 3 minutes. I wanted to support, I'm speaking in support of Vision Zero. I'm obviously a resident here in the city, but I'm also, just as of Friday, I stepped off of the position of Safe Routes to Schools coordinator as that grant ended with UW Health and the Healthy Kids Collaborative. And so traffic safety and walking and biking, especially with youth and children and families, is a focus of my work and a deep passion of mine. And I think what I'm especially encouraged by is just that that Vision Zero will emphasize, it appears, engagement over enforcement. I know that a strategy in other cities around Vision Zero, there are resources that are dedicated more to enforcement. And from the Safe Routes to Schools world, just last month, they operate from a theoretical framework that focuses on 6 E's: engineering, evaluation, equity, encouragement, and I'm forgetting one of the other ones right now. But last but not least, they used to have enforcement, and they've switched that to engagement. Now they've replaced that with engagement, and I see it as a great opportunity for us to really check in with communities, especially those that have been targeted unfairly traffic stops and violations and things like that, and think about and ask them, what is your vision for safe streets? What do you believe enforcement could or should look like, and things like that. And so I'm encouraged by the Vision Zero work, and I'm looking forward to hear especially the community engagement piece that's coming soon. And also I'm really excited to continue to work with the city and the board as we look to do some complete streets work and advocacy. I see that as sort of a related work plan and project that I know we're going to be looking at coordinating with you all and hoping to help connect the city and perhaps the board to different community-based organizations that we've worked with and we are planning to work with to make sure that Complete Streets and Vision Zero really live up to the I think the ambitious goals that both of these projects have. So thank you so much, and I appreciate the presentation, Yang. It was very thorough.
Thank you, Sean. Your timing was just about perfect. All right, our next speaker, Bob Schaefer, 6 Cottonwood Circle, Madison, in opposition, wishing to speak. Mr. Schaefer, are you with us?
I am. I just unmuted.
All right, you may go ahead.
I am not opposed to safety. In fact, I'm a very much so supporter of that. However, that one of the things that I've often observed is that one of the problems is we try to use the same square foot of surface for too many modes of movement. And that when we look at the concept of streets, that streets are built for vehicular traffic. The concrete thickness, the pavement, the number of lanes and everything like that is all built for vehicular traffic. Pedestrians use sidewalks, they use gravel paths, other things like that are adequate for them. Now, I do realize that we do have a problem when we are trying to cross things, and I think that a thing that comes to mind always was stop, look, and listen for railroad tracks. And I think that what happens at times is that we could improve the signalization, we could improve the pedestrian information as to when it was safe to cross the street. When we take roads like East Washington, which I think is one of the targeted roads, that if we reduce the speed limit down to 25 miles an hour, that's going to frustrate people. When people get frustrated, they lose patience. And that what we have to do is we have to provide good, safe means for people to know when it is safe to cross the street. When you look at the concept of the pedestrian is king and they step out onto the road, that all the traffic should stop on a 6-lane road or 3 lanes in each direction, that the problem is that the right-hand lane may see them, but the other lanes may not. And so if the pedestrian crosses in confidence, that's how we can have some injuries. So I think that if we look at some pedestrian information screens, that using technology to identify where brakes are, that it might be something to look into as to letting pedestrians know when traffic brakes are coming up so that they can cross safely when there are no traffic controls to aid in that.
We've got about 30 seconds left, just letting you know.
Okay. I do want to just make another statement that on the Transit X concept, that zero accidents is one of the objectives.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schaefer. I'm sorry, were there any questions for either of our 2 speakers? I didn't ask for our previous one. Forgot to do that. Okay, seeing none, let's see. Anne, were there any new registrants for wishing to speak?
No.
Okay. Then the other 2 registrants that were on here were Lisa Sharon, 1317 East Wilson Street in support, and Alexander Howard, 6835 Mater Drive in support. And then we did receive a letter from the Marquette Neighborhood Association that was attached to Legistar about 20 minutes before the meeting began. Assuming that not all of you had a chance to read that, it's fairly brief, so I'll read it here as soon as I pull it up. Dear city officials, the Marquette Neighborhood Association Transportation and Safety Committee writes to express our support for the implementation of Vision Zero tactics in the East Washington Avenue corridor, namely the portion which runs through our neighborhood from Blair to First Streets. We've witnessed a dramatic expansion of residential buildings, office space, and entertainment destinations in the East Washington corridor. Accompanying that, we've been pleased to see a significant increase in pedestrian traffic, bicyclists, and sidewalk activity. Unfortunately, we've also witnessed drag racing, road rage incidents, and traffic deaths in this corridor. MNA strongly supports transitioning to more visible continental-style crosswalks to enhance pedestrian safety as they cross the avenue to shop and dine, attend events, complete activities of daily living, and return home. Reducing the speed limit from 35 miles per hour to 25 miles per hour in this corridor to improve crash statistics and safety in the bicycle lane. The retiming of traffic signals to accompany the speed limit change. MNA expresses a desire to see the signal timing also ensure that pedestrians can cross the entire width of the avenue at once rather than in 2 light cycles, as is currently the case at some intersections. We would also advocate for bollards to be installed on the median at busy crossings. First Street is of particular concern. We are so pleased to see the city take a stance in favor of pedestrian safety, as it is of the utmost importance to us given recent incidents. We'd like the city to also take into consideration the many future buildings in the works, as we will only see increased vehicle volume entering, exiting parking structures, as those same buildings draw even more pedestrians to the sidewalks. We believe that improving pedestrian safety would also increase the amount of people who feel comfortable crossing that corridor to make short trips, both for leisure and activities of daily living. We hope to reduce the number of residents who drive, for instance, between the Williamson and Johnson corridors when walking would be practical. As our corridor continues its success story transitioning from empty auto lots and warehouses to a vibrant urban center, let us also make non-motorized forms of transportation safer and more feasible for everyone. On behalf of the MNA board, thank you for your consideration. Lance Latimer, Transportation and Safety Co-Chair. Okay, I believe that's all for registrants for public comment and things that were submitted. Questions for staff? I'm not seeing any hands. Oh, Alder Foster. Seeing your hand in the camera.
Yeah, I think with maybe if Ian could stop sharing his screen, it would get us
Oh, I do see a hand. Where is it? Oh, there you go. I wasn't delayed. There you go. Go ahead, Alder Foster.
Thank you. I guess my first question is, we're lead on this, but it was also referred to Transportation Commission, I believe Board of Public Works. Can staff speak to what we heard back from those groups?
Could you repeat that? Sorry, I got some background noise here.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, I was wondering what feedback we got from the Transportation Commission and the Board of Public Works. I was on TC, so I guess I know that, but I think the rest of the board should probably hear that feedback and recommendations. And not sure if there was any discussion at Board of Public Works.
Sure. Yeah. Great question. Yeah. So I can provide a quick summarize on that. Generally both bodies were very supportive for the initiative. There's some discussions on different things. For example, at Board of Public Works, there's some discussion about whether there should be more physical improvements, goes along with, speed reduction projects. On that, I think, everybody agrees that it would be great to have more, physical components to change the appearance of the roadways, so people knows at what speed they should drive. But we also have to regularize, the environment has been, has changed on some of the streets, as mentioned by the letter from Tenny Marquette neighborhood, East Washington Avenue, for example. Things has changed. There are lots of more activities the area basically changed from a urban parking lot to very urban high density area with a lot of pedestrian activities. Traffic already have already slowed down on itself. There's lots of congestion already. People are not really driving at 35 miles per hour anymore. In that sense, already kind of makes sense to reduce speed limit. We haven't been keeping up with that yet. Another consideration is that the limited funding that we have. Some of the streets desirable to get more features in, more physical features in, but we have to work with the amount of funds that we have. And again, hopefully by through some federal funding mechanism, we can get a little bit more money to do the physical component of it. That's the major discussion at the DPW. Also some discussion about we have to be data focused, use data to make decisions, where to make investments. For Transportation Commission, the major discussion on that on this resolution is about the police involvement in the initiative. The commission think enforcement is important, but on the other hand, some members pointed out that there may be unproportionate impact on some populations, and urge the city to be very thoughtful, considerate on those efforts, not causing intended harm to certain populations, especially the underserved populations, minorities. Some discussions about when we do use enforcement, how can things be done to be very mindful about that. For example, maybe focus on when making traffic stops, focus on moving violations. Maybe not, for example, expired license, things like that. With understanding that, in our community, unfortunately, there are members still have to decide whether to pay for food, rent, or to renew their registration. When you face that decision, all of us will likely to, just choose to pay for food or rent. I think that's, one major consideration from Transportation Commission. Transportation Commission also came up with some language, suggests to, as amendment to the resolution, it's a focus on exactly that. Ask the resolution to acknowledge the potential harm, enforcement may do to certain populations, and be very mindful on that. So that's a quick summary for both bodies. Wondering other staff members or members on both committees has anything to add to that.
Ying, do we have the actual recommendations that came? As you mentioned, TC recommended approval with, I think there were 2 recommended amendments to it. Is that text not available? I didn't see it in Legistar anywhere, but it seems like that would be good for us to be looking at. I know at TC, we probably spent a half hour talking and trying to get some of that together. So I guess it would be good to have available, but does nobody have a copy of that?
That's a great question. I'm wondering if Renee or Annie, you have those languages, the languages?
Yeah, I do. I can read it for you. I think I have it correctly. So the first amendment to the resolution was acknowledge the harm that traffic enforcement can bring to Black, Indigenous people of color and disproportionate harm that Black, Indigenous people of color communities experience due to traffic violence. So that was the first amendment that for the resolution. And then the second was, in addition, staff are directed to work with the Transportation Policy Planning Board on developing the Vision Zero action plan.
Thank you, Renee. Appreciate that. And did Board of Public Works have anything similar, or do they just recommend approval as is?
BPW recommended the approval as it is. But I think TC expects us to work with TPBB, since TPBB is the agency on it, to finalize that language for that amendment.
Okay, thank you. Regarding the action plan, is there a rough time frame for that, when that action plan would be finalized?
That's a great question. So our initial plan, this is before COVID-19. We want to, finish that action plan by end of the year. Since COVID-19 started, many departments got put away, responding to all different kinds of emergencies. So the progress on that has been slowed down. So we just had 4 work groups set up, work on the 4 different components of the action plan. Those group hasn't got a chance really to meet a lot, getting going yet. So what we have to check on those progresses and update the group when the action plan can be expected to complete. But we would rather to be able to do that sooner rather than later, so that we have a better roadmap for the next few years.
May I speak, Tom?
Sure.
Yes, go ahead.
So, just as a frame of reference, I believe the city of Minneapolis took 12 to 18 months to complete their action plan. It's just they had a considerable amount of public involvement associated with it, which ours would have a different type of public involvement, but it's not something that occurs necessarily in 3 months. So.
Thank you. And then you mentioned, Yang, the work groups. Could you just, repeat what the names of those were and give a brief description of what those current work groups are?
Yes. So we kind of think that it's going to be a big effort. So let's divide and conquer and identify the key components of the action plan. So we actually read quite a few action plans from different cities that's already doing this. We feel like a good approach for us is to divide the strategy into 4 categories. So one category is called safe streets, which will involve street design, infrastructure. How do we provide the infrastructure that's safe for all modes? That with human feeling considered. So that's one group. Another group is called safe vehicles. So those are we're looking at how the vehicle technologies can help improve safety, and also how to manage different fleets, maybe including encouraging maybe less use of those, for example, so we can reduce the number of heavy vehicles on the roadway, or smaller vehicles for same task. So that's another category. And the third category is safe people, which is mainly about all the different users in the group. How can we form a really positive safety culture, so we can really change people's behavior, which is has been proven very difficult. So the final component is safe data. We really want to focus on data. Use data as a guiding point when we're making any decisions. So that not only involves the data that derived from crash reports, but we want to go beyond that. The vehicle data, public health data, equity data. We really want to dive into it. So those are the four categories.
Thank you. Those are all my questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Alder Foster. Baltazar, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Yang and Rene, for providing this information. So, and I don't know if I'm, just please direct me if I am asking the question in the right time. So, Yang, you mentioned, Yang and Rene, you mentioned about that amendment. And I just wanted to just hear just a little bit. I think you mentioned that the amendment calls for an acknowledgement of the harm that this causes to communities of color. I think I'm having issues understanding that acknowledgement of the potential harm, and I would like to know, in a little bit more background information, or maybe, obviously as someone who comes from another country, I want to understand what do they mean by that. If there is some extra information that, that will help us, because, anyway, so what do they mean by acknowledgement of potential harm? And I know what that means, but I might be confused. If you can help me with that, that would be great.
Sure, I can start. I think Renee will definitely can add on to it. My understanding from a discussion of transportation emission is that when we talk about enforcement, even on their face, it may appear that the officers are using the same criteria, but because of underlying issues, there might be some bias involved, and also because our social grounds are different, and the people of color have suffer disproportionately from those enforcement efforts, like traffic stops. For example, people may be cited for different things. If one example is that they may drive with expired vehicle registration, just because they cannot afford to renew it every year. But because a traffic stop, now they got a charge for different things. So I think that's kind of the things that the commission has been discussing. Renee, want to add to it?
Sure, and I certainly don't want to speak for what everyone was thinking of, but I think it's that traffic stops are different for different people, that there are racial biases, that what the outcomes of that stop can be very different. There, of course, have been cases across the country where people are just pulled over for a routine traffic stop, and that situation escalates, and people people of color have ended up dead from that stop. Just that there are disproportionate impacts of the tickets in terms of what people can afford, and that there are racial biases in, do you get a warning? Do you get a ticket? Do you get multiple tickets? So I think just trying to acknowledge that situation within our country.
Is that all you had, Baltazar?
Yeah, so, and maybe that will be later for the discussion. So, but I think just a general question, not for people to answer, but, I think if we're acknowledging their harms that can be caused, why not to get rid of that causes the harm? So anyway, but that's going to be more for the discussion. So I think, we're talking about some of these issues that are happening and everything that's happening. So, my question, not to anyone in particular, why maybe we need to just get rid of that is causing that harm and that is putting our communities of color in that harm, instead of just acknowledging it. So no, thank you very much. That will be more part of my comment later. Thank you.
Okay, any additional questions for staff? All right, seeing none, I believe the item before us then is to recommend or support adopting and endorsing a Vision Zero policy. Alder Furman, I see your hand popped up there for a moment.
I assume you were looking for a motion, but I can.
Yes, go ahead.
I would like to move approval.
There's been a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Alder Kemble. Discussion. Alder Furman, did you want to speak to your motion? All right, seeing no hands up for, oh, I do see one there. Baltazar, go ahead. Make sure you're unmuted, Baltazar.
Yeah. So, okay. Obviously, I am all 100% for Vision Zero. Although I always say that, Madison is not Europe, but, I think we have a great opportunity for something here. At the same time, I do have, I do have concerns about the whole enforcement piece as this stands right now. I was disappointed by the fact that we are just acknowledging the potential harm. And, I am a person of color, but I'm trying to be as less biased, but I cannot help that. I think we experience a lot of issues with the police force, and I think this is an opportunity for us to, just like Sean said, to change the whole concept of, can we do something else besides enforcement? Can we do community engagement? I think we have tried many times, working with the police and doing enforcement, and it has not worked out from my experience and many of the experiences of my community. So I don't know if maybe we need to move into doing some community engagement, and possibly put some funds into that area. Anyway, so I'm, kind of concerned about even just acknowledging the potential harm. I think we need to stop that harm. And, I think we are in a place where we can make some change here. And if we are recognizing the harm, what are we doing about that? Anyway, so I just put it out there that, as much as I am in favor of Vision Zero, I think Vision Zero without us getting rid of that potential harm or trying to figure out ways how we can serve our communities better and not put them in that potential harm, I think, otherwise it's not going to work. So thank you.
Thank you, Baltazar. Alder Foster, go ahead.
Thank you, and thanks to Baltazar for those comments. I think actually partly in line with what Baltazar is saying, and one of the recommendations from the Transportation Commission was to have a more explicit responsibility for the Transportation Policy and Planning Board in, I think, both developing and approving the action plan. So that's something that I would very much support. I think we have had similar conversations with the MOPES study, which I think we'll be talking about next. And we've seen with that one, obviously there's been a lot of challenges to that, and it's sort of, we're getting a good update for the first time here soon. But part of my concerns with that resolution is that it directed staff to go and basically come up with a plan that I think is very, has a lot of policy embedded in it by necessity. And I think the same thing holds true here. I mean, Vision Zero as a concept is sort of easy enough for us to understand, but it doesn't really feel straightforward enough for me at this point to ask staff to come up with an action plan. And as I'm reading the resolution right now, it doesn't really call out even, when that will be done, that it would come to us, any involvement that the board has along the way. I know this is something that we talked about, I think, as a potential work group at one point. So I guess that's, my thought is that the board needs to take ownership of this as well, and that we can't just put it on staff and say, okay, come up with an action plan for us, because particularly, I mean, the kinds of things that Balthazar was talking about, I mean, this is going to take really pushing, and that's generally something that I think our policy boards have to take more of a role in. We can't expect staff to go and do all this heavy policy pushing, because it's just, I don't think it's going to happen. So staff has a huge role in this, and I think we need to ask them to do a lot of work around it, but they also need to have some clear guidance from policymakers so that they know that they're going in the direction that's supported. So that would be one thing. I guess that's already encapsulated in that TC recommendation, so I would want to see that adopted with our recommendation. I do think that calling out the harm from enforcement is worthwhile to put in this resolution as well. We have seen with several cities that have adopted Vision Zero, part of their approach has been more enforcement, and that has actually led to worsening some of these problems. So I think at least acknowledging it is important so that it's really in front of us as we start working on this action plan. And I think that's, I guess, the third piece that I really like to see in here is that we have to take that question of enforcement head on. I know some have suggested we just don't want to include enforcement as one of the things that we're dealing with, or it's not part of Vision Zero, but the reality is we have police officers that we're paying just to do traffic enforcement. And either we're going to stop paying them and stop asking them to do enforcement, or we need to address that as part of our Vision Zero work. If that enforcement that's happening today is not improving safety, then we need to figure out why and we need to stop it. And if it is supporting what we're trying to do with Vision Zero, or if there are ways that we can change it to make it support it better, I think it needs to be part of the plan. So I would be in favor of actually explicitly dealing with this really contentious issue of enforcement head on as it relates to Vision Zero, because we're not going to get there by not talking about it or just saying, oh, we're going to do a Vision Zero exercise. We're just looking at engineering. We're not going to talk about enforcement. And meanwhile, we're paying MPD to go and enforce traffic laws and pretending like it's not part of Vision Zero. So I guess those are three elements I'd like to see added in our recommendation. Oh, and a specific timeline for getting that action plan created. I think that's actually one of the requirements or expectations of the network, is that we either already have the action plan done or that we have a real commitment to it. So I think a commitment needs to have a time frame on it. Thanks.
So is there an amendment to the motion?
Looks like Margaret's got a comment. Maybe after discussion, we can put it in the form of an amendment.
Okay. Go ahead, Margaret.
Yeah, well, actually, my question was exactly that, whether the amendments from the Transportation Committee are on the floor or not. I don't think they are. We just moved the amendment. We just moved the resolution as written. So I'll make the motion to add the language that was approved by the Transportation Commission to the main motion.
Alder Furman, go ahead.
I'd be happy to second that.
Okay. Go ahead, Margaret. Continue.
I'll just to briefly weigh in on this issue of recognition versus action. Yes, absolutely. But at the same time, recognizing that some of the harm that comes from disproportionate enforcement against people of color is actually, it's a state level problem. In the 1990s, rules were enacted. I believe it was in the early 90s, maybe it was the late 80s, whereby if somebody, say, didn't pay their speeding ticket within a certain period of time, that their licenses would be suspended. And that then would roll into, gee, the next time you're stopped, not only do you have this speeding ticket on your record, but you also have a license that has been suspended for 5 years. That's something that the city of Madison can't change at state level, but that doesn't mean we can't ask our lobbyists to work on it, et cetera. There are a number of rules like that that have to do with forfeitures. So that's all I would add at this point.
Thank you, Margaret. Alder Foster, go ahead.
Thanks. I guess just maybe a question for staff. In terms of the best way for the board to participate and support staff on the work, is this something that we think we should be doing as a full board as part of our regular meetings, or is there value in considering either adding board members to the work groups or having a subgroup of this that's working on it? I guess, what are the thoughts on the best kind of way to operationalize this to make sure there is that participation from the board?
That's a great question. So I think there are a number of possible ways. I think, maybe the traditional way is that the staff team work on those action plan, and we'll bring back to the board periodically for review and input. That would be a kind of traditional process for like other city projects. But I think the other arrangements may be beneficial as well. For example, maybe appointing TPP representatives on each of those 4 groups, for example. So I think, or kind of hybrid approach. I think all those are possible. I think it just depends on how the board wants to be involved, and we can also discuss with the team and the mayor as well to figure out the best way moving forward. But I do agree that it would be great to have TPP involvement along the way when we develop an action plan.
And was there a thought on this, an appropriate timeline? I know you said previously you were shooting for the end of the year. Things have been delayed. Would you feel comfortable with a June 1st of 21 deadline for this action plan? Or I think it's important that we put something on there. Obviously, it can be extended, but I think just saying we're gonna develop one isn't quite good enough. Do you have any?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe we can use the June 1st as the tentative timeline. But I think that will largely depends on I think the COVID-19 situation and how we can cope with that. For example, one area we really want to do is public engagement. I think as many of the registrants kind of speak out as well. It's important to get the community involved. So right now, our ways to involve the communities are limited. We can we could do some online engagement, but not sure how much people we can reach out. So so I think we can set a timeline, but depends on how things go. As part with public engagement, we can revise as well.
Okay, thank you. You're muted, Tom, if you're talking to us.
Robert, you're up next. Go ahead.
Thanks. Mine's brief. I agree with everything that Balthazar said. I think eventually we need a lot more than acknowledgement. We need action. I do think that maybe to start, acknowledgement helps guide where Vision Zero goes as we develop what Vision Zero actually is. And so I think right now acknowledgement is a good thing, but it's not the final thing. And I hope that, I think that this is a good start. So, and I think Balthazar is next, so he can comment on what he thinks.
Thank you, Robert. Balthazar, go ahead.
So, I just going back to that acknowledge. I think, again, I totally understand. I think, acknowledging something is great. I think that's why our communities of color has been in the place where they are, because we have been acknowledged, but we have not given the opportunity to have our own voices. Anyway, but one thing that I do want to say is, is there something that we can do to, as we move forward, we have this acknowledgement, that's great, but are there any actions that we as a board can request or can demand so we can prevent that harm? I mean, is there, and I'm not a politician, I'm not I don't know how to write these amendments and all of that. The only thing that I know is that if we only continue acknowledging, and I understand that, yes, acknowledging is a plus. We have many plus already. That feels a lot like patronizing our communities. I think, if we are not here to be patronized, I think, and I mean, I don't know what else to say. I just wish we as a board, we are a powerful group. You guys have a lot of knowledge. So is there anything that we can do? And I am kind of just asking for your help, for us to be able not just to acknowledge, but to make sure that there are some actions to prevent and to fight that harm. And I don't understand. I wish I understand the whole process and all of that. But yeah, I mean, it will be, even before moving forward, I mean, if we don't call it out, nothing is going to happen. In my experience, I've been in this country for the last, God knows, 23 years, and acknowledging is not enough. And I just want to make sure that it is clear that Baltasar de Santana is not very happy with that word. That's destroying our community. I'm sorry, but that's a big offense. That's very patronizing to our communities. So thank you, and again, you guys are very smart and you know how to do things. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Balthazar. Eric, you're up next.
Yeah, thanks, Balthazar, for pushing on this. As we've been discussing it, I've been trying to figure out what stronger language, action-oriented language, would be appropriate in this motion and in the kickoff of Vision Zero, which doesn't yet have its action plan. So what I've come up with, and I'll see if the body thinks this is worth adding as an amendment to the amendment, that the action plan, that an initial part of the action plan shall be documentation of the harms done by enforcement to communities of color in the name of traffic crash reduction, that shall lead to a discussion on ways to avoid those harms and reduce those harms going forward as part of the action plan. So it's a two-step. First is to get everything down on paper so that we as policymakers are familiar with what these are. So, Margaret was talking about there's a state aspect to it and there's local. What can we do? What do we need the lobbyists to do? Maybe there's like, so what are the harms? Where are they coming from? And then second part of the action plan would address how to reduce and hopefully eliminate them, although that's kind of like Vision Zero, eliminate those as we also work to eliminate crashes. So that was very convoluted, but I guess, Tom, am I in order to just make that a motion? Part of the motion?
We technically have a second. We're on a sub motion right now. And it has the current motion on the floor is to add the language from TC, which has been seconded. So this could be an amendment to that amendment, as long as Margaret and Alder Furman are okay with it. I'm seeing.
No, I'm absolutely okay with that.
I'm seeing nodding heads. So.
Yeah, and I'm okay with withdrawing our amendment and just having that be the amendment that we vote on.
Okay, that works for me.
As long as so the idea would be that we would take. Otherwise, it gets very confusing. But I think that amendment focuses on exactly, and it'll be up to Margaret since she's the primary. But I would be supportive of, taking away what I seconded and instead us putting on the table amending the original motion with what Eric said.
Okay, that sounds like, Margaret, it sounds like it's okay with you as well.
Yeah, and I'll speak to it briefly as well, which is, it's a sort of a two-parter is what I heard Eric saying. One is to, document the dimensions of the problem and then develop an actual, steps to take to address that. And yes, absolutely, both those things are necessary. In fact, I think that we actually already have a lot of the documentation on traffic stops, on ticketing, on revocation of licenses, etc. We certainly know what the state laws on refusing driver's licenses to people who are not documented has done, which is a huge safety issue as well. So I think that we have, I don't think that's a heavy lift. Okay, I think we have a lot of the documentation, and I think we know a lot of the steps to take to address that. So yes, absolutely, it's friendly.
I'm just writing for a moment here. Okay. Eric, you still had I have your hand still up. Did you have anything else you wanted to add before I move on to the next person? You're muted. Okay. Looks like you're good. Alder Foster, then you're up next.
Thank you. I guess I was just going to add to that suggestion that perhaps even explicitly this should be a fifth work group that tackles this ask. I think Eric's, the motion is that the stuff gets written down, but I think realistically to make sure that happens, perhaps even having it be called out as one of the staff work groups. I know I've had probably 5 hours of conversation with Lieutenant Fury around this topic over the last couple of weeks. I know he's super passionate and has a lot of ideas already, has access to a lot of this information. I know he would be willing to participate, is interested in participating in that. I know there are probably other staff. I know I'd be willing to help with that as well. So I guess may not even need to be a change in the amendment just to keep things simple. But I think actually just having this be a work group that has this this task with this might help.
Thank you, Alder Foster. So currently for the items on the amendment, I have adding the language that was added by the Transportation Commission as part of the initial action plan documenting the effects of enforcement on people of color and the impacts of fatalities and injuries on people of color. and then steps that will be taken to reduce and eliminate those effects, with a focus on people of color in addition to the overall Vision Zero concept. The other two items that I have that are not, in my mind, at least at the moment, officially part of the amendment are to potentially have a fifth working group to work on some of that, and then also a timeline. Is anybody else thinking differently at this point? Okay.
Can I just get clarification? I thought that they had removed the amendment, the original amendment proposed by Margaret, and now it's just Eric's amendment. Am I wrong about that?
I think that is correct. Or I think that is correct.
Okay, and then does Eric's amendment have a second?
So we would need, yes. Let's ask for a second, then we can have it official.
Yeah, I'm happy to second
I'll
that.
second.
Okay. All right, Alderperman spoke first. So,
you can give it to Margaret since it was her original amendment. That's fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
Flip a coin. Okay. So is there any discussion, any further discussion, questions, comments? Okay. So on the amendment to add those three items that I mentioned earlier, is there any question on what those are? Make sure you're unmuted. All those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Opposed, no. Okay, that passes unanimously. Then onto the main motion. Getting some feedback here. Adopting and endorsing a Vision Zero policy to eliminate fatalities and serious injuries that are a result of crashes on streets and paths within the city of Madison by 2030, with the amendment that we just voted on. Is there any discussion? Alder Foster.
I would move an amendment to add a action plan to be completed no later than June 1st of 2021, and that the Transportation Policy and Planning Board will be the lead policy group to review and recommend adoption of the final plan.
Is there a second? Just unmute yourself and.
I'd like to second that.
Alderperman second. Discussion. Alder Foster, did you want to continue to comment or? Okay. Any discussion? All right. All those in favor of the timeline for completion of, what was it? I had it written down here. June 1st, 2021, say aye.
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 Opposed, no. All right. That's added. Then on the main motion, is there any discussion, comments, questions? All right, all those in favor of adopting endorsing a Vision Zero policy with all of the amendments, say aye.
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 Opposed, no. All right, that passes unanimously. Thank you, everyone. We will move on to item number 4, Legistar 60918. Amending the 2020 adopted capital budget to appropriate $3 million in GEO borrowing for the East-West Bus Rapid Transit project in the transportation project in order to comply with FTA funding requirements necessary to enter project development. Being accepted by FTA into project development is a prerequisite for FTA's Small Starts project evaluation.
Perhaps I'll provide some background.
Go ahead, Tom.
In the 2020 capital budget, $4 million was appropriated for BRT in 2020, and then about 9.2 in 2021. That was just part of the environmental professional consultant services that are laid out. We submitted a request to enter project development this March, maybe it was in May. And FTA, I guess they require that you have the full amount of money necessary to complete project development already appropriated. I guess that's a requirement. the fact that it's in the capital budget is not sufficient. It actually has to be appropriated. So what this amendment does is it takes $3 million that was in the 2021 budget and places it in the 2020 budget. We won't spend it. We won't spend it on consultants in 2020. We are just doing this solely to satisfy the FTA requirement so that we can enter the project development phase. This is an important step because we are not able to submit our project for evaluation in the Small Starts program August 28th unless we have officially entered the project development phase.
I don't believe we have any register. Oh, let me check here. We might.
We do, Bob Schaefer.
Okay. Bob, are you still with us? Looks like you are. I'll get you unmuted here. Hey, Bob, can you hear me?
I am. Is that the extent of the presentation?
I believe so.
Yes, this is solely to satisfy an FTA requirement.
So it's just a formality, but yes, it's the end of the presentation. So go ahead, Mr. Schaefer, if you'd like to speak.
Okay. I guess that what I do is I question moving ahead with the project. But when I review some of the documentation that's been produced so far, that I see some discrepancies that probably don't have time to go into all of them right now. And some of the documentation does not appear to have done a lot of study. Just for example, that one of the Downtown Coordinating Committee reports indicated the Go Indy project as being something that was going ahead at full steam. And when I looked it up, it's actually been a failure. So I think that what we need to do is we need to do more research and look at that, especially in today's world. And what I've advised the committee to do is to take some of the buses that we have now and sort of pretend that they're, by identifying them as bus rapid transit, to see how effective that's going to be and what the ridership would be. Because when they did the 10,000 to 15,000 projection, that when I looked up all of the BRT stations that they had selected and added up all the boardings, that it came out to be about that amount, and that not all of those boardings would be boardings that would be going on the route. And so I just think that there needs to be some more clarification and documentation as to the documentation that's being provided now and the data behind it.
Tom, you're still muted.
Thanks, Robert.
Am I muted now?
No. Thank you, Mr. Schaefer. Are there any questions for the speaker? All right, seeing none. Let me switch gears here. Any questions for staff? Alder Foster, go ahead.
Yeah, just I guess to Bob's question or comment, I've heard from some of my constituents similar question or comments, and I think it's something that some of the community are wondering, just given what's been going on with COVID, is are we changing course? There was a lot of discussion at our last budget around this item. We passed a really controversial wheel tax to at least in part to fund these efforts. Obviously, we have our big network study ahead of us, but I think Bob's question represents others in the community. And while there might not have been a presentation on it tonight, I wonder if staff is thinking about that question or working on an answer to that question, so that I guess at least members of the Common Council will know, are we basically staying the course in terms of our expected investments in BRT and our plans there?
Yes, we are moving forward. We would like to get in line for federal funding. Typically there's a wait, and last I checked, there was 14 or 15 cities in line. We are evaluating the whole transit system. In fact, I think soon you'll be sponsoring a resolution as we look at our whole system and how we strengthen not just the east-west line, but also perhaps the north-south line as part of that restructure. So yes, we are submitting a small starts evaluation. Now, whether we choose to move forward beyond that, and let's say if we were awarded the money, we entering into an agreement with the FTA, that's another council action, right? In fact, in your SIP this year, the council will be voting on the budget regarding it. So we are moving forward, but we are very cognizant of not only the effects of COVID towards transit use, but also the effects of COVID towards traffic on our streets. So, I don't know if I probably didn't.
No, I think that's fine, and it was only, it's a half question, half comment, but I do think that you're going to get those questions going forward, and so I think it would be helpful at the policy and planning board. We should be having a clear vision, and if it's simply restating, yep, this is the path we are on. COVID happened. Here's what's going on right now, but we either have adjusted or are not adjusting our projected plans moving forward as it relates to BRT implementation. I think it'd be good to just be explicit about that moving forward at any of those other decision points that you mentioned.
I think Justin in his presentation to the Transportation Commission kind of alluded to the fact that we are expecting to operate at about 85% of our revenue hours. That's what we can support. I think we continue to believe that bus rapid transit is not necessarily an add-on or an extra thing, but it may be the most efficient way for us to provide transit service along some of these transit arterials, you might say. So we are not looking at it so much as an add-on, but as perhaps the most cost-effective way to provide a service.
All right. Thank you, Alder Foster. I think it's important, I guess, for all of us to remember that there are decisions that we've made regarding BRT and other things that may need to be revisited over time because of things changing. Anyway, with that, are there any further questions, comments? Okay, then I'd be looking for a motion. Alder Furman?
Move adoption.
Is there a second? I see Alder Foster's hand up there. Discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of amending the 2020 adopted capital budget to appropriate $3 million in general obligation borrowing for the East-West Bus Rapid Transit Project in the Transportation Project in order to comply with FTA funding requirements necessary to enter project development, accepted by FTA into project development as a prerequisite for FTA small starts project evaluation. All those in favor of adoption, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed, no. Hearing none, that is unanimous. And then we will move on to item 5, Legistar 61174, Madison Ordinance Analysis of Parking Strategies, MOPS Transportation Demand Management, TDM. I think Dave Trowbridge is going to give us an introduction first.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, board members, for your patience. Just in terms of background, the Madison Ordinance Analysis of Parking Strategies has been in place for probably over a year, maybe a year and a half now, and moving forward and looking at ways that we can think about parking differently: on-street parking, off-street parking, parking that's associated with developments, existing land uses as well as future land uses. And I'd say about 3 or 4 months ago, we had an opportunity from the Bloomberg Harvard group to employ the services of Sharuvi Begwani. Thank you so much for joining us, Sharuvi. We are very fortunate to have her help us with regards to transportation demand management and the use of such measures in the city. And this is something that isn't new to us. We've been employing TDM measures for 20 years in various degrees, mostly as parts of conditions of approval for certain land uses that come before the Plan Commission, for example. But many communities in the country have taken TDM to a much higher degree and really employed a much broader set of strategies in their communities. Many of them, of course, are the beneficiaries of very strong state laws, like you see in California and the state of Washington, for example. We do not have that here, but what we do have is a desire, I think, to advance TDM as one way to manage parking, not just as part of new developments that come forward, but it's also potentially as part of existing developments, of which there are many opportunities. And I think what we're very happy that Sharuvi has been able to develop for us is kind of a synopsis of basically how we use TDM right now, and she'll talk about that a little bit, why it's important for us as we move forward, and then to also share with us what she's learned, taking a look around the country at different approaches for how we might fashion our approach moving forward, potentially looking at an actual ordinance that would, again, be moving through the council and through this TPPB. It is a very important policy issue, not just in terms of transportation, but also land use. You know, developments are happening all around the city, and pleased to say they're happening in places where we want to see them take place. They're on the BRT corridor, they're where we have good transit service. Now, how do we take that to the next level so that we can provide those incentives for people to not drive, number one, and secondly, so the developers don't have to provide, 5 parking spaces per 1,000 square foot of office space, for example, like you see in suburban office parks. Can we do with less? And what role does TDM play in that? So with that, I will stop talking and let Sharuvi take it away. I forget, Tom.
Actually, yeah.
Maybe have a word or two. So, Tom.
Yeah, I just wanted to provide some context. Liddell Zeller is one of her last resolutions last spring of 2019 was the MOPS resolution. We had moved forward as a department and actually gave some presentations to the TPPB the summer of 2019. At that time, we got involved in a Bloomberg Harvard effort that looked at TDM measures. And so we took actually a pause. I think it was a 6 to 9 month pause. And we got an approval to, how do I want to put it, to delay the results of the MOPE study. I think it was by about 1 year. And I think you guys voted on that perhaps 2 months ago, 3 months ago. So that just provides a little context. Everything that Dave said about Sharuvi, we've been impressed with what she's done in just a month or so. And I think she'll lay out 2 main questions. And I think Eric will be able to augment some of the discussion as well. So thank you for allowing me just to give a couple words.
Sure, Tom. All right, go ahead, Sharuvi.
Good evening, everyone. As Dave already mentioned, a citywide TDM ordinance is in the pipeline, and the urgency for that has been observed in recent discussions on TDM plans for projects such as Madison Yards. I'll be running you through some of the design considerations for the TDM program. So I'll be starting with a brief overview of ongoing TDM efforts in Madison and why a TDM program is needed. I'll then delve into the key questions and considerations that need to be addressed when designing a TDM program and how it's being successfully done in a couple of other cities. I then hope to initiate a discussion on the draft purpose statement and responsible party. And these are key aspects on which further discussion and some kind of decision today would really help kickstart the actual framing of the ordinance. Then there are some additional points at the end related to TOD and structure of a TMA, which can be discussed if time permits. So just to give an introduction, TDM or Transportation Demand Management has several definitions, various strategies that increase transportation system efficiency, set of strategies aimed at maximizing traveler choices, effective choices to improve travel reliability, ways of reducing number or length of auto trips. And the transportation plan of Madison itself defines it as policies and strategies implemented to shift travel patterns to better manage congestion. So looking at these and various other definitions, the primary purpose and objectives of TDM can be broadly summarized through these 5 aspects. Mitigating VMT or vehicle miles traveled, which is basically reduction of vehicular trips, car trips. Supporting multimodalism and more equitable access by encouraging alternative transportation. So you have biking, walking, transit, of course. Mitigating congestion, which is basically reducing queuing, increasing travel speeds, and reducing travel time. A point to be noted here is that ideally when you reduce VMT, congestion should be reduced, but often it may not be the case. Congestion can often be targeted by reducing peak hour traffic through measures such as flexible work schedule, and that would not really help in reducing the overall trips. So when we're looking at the focus of a TDM program, we might want to consider focusing on reducing the overall number of trips. And then, of course, there's the point about supporting transit-oriented development along our proposed East-West BRT corridor. And then finally, the point on reducing traffic-related safety impacts, which sort of relates to all the previously mentioned points. So TDM has been an option for approving conditional uses for the past 15 years. It was incorporated in the zoning ordinance in 2005. It may be required for these 3 other zoning categories since 2012. So in the employment campus district, it is required, it may be required for a rezoning submittal. For a mixed-use center district, again, it may be required, and this is based on the discretion of the traffic engineer. And as per the Urban Design Commission ordinance, there's a requirement of all the single retail business establishments of over 40,000 square feet to have a TDM plan. So that's necessary, and that section actually gives out a couple of measures from which 3 measures need to be selected. So just to summarize the existing TDM efforts in Madison, most of you are probably aware of how TDM requirements have been ad hoc so far. They've been based on the discretion of the city staff and the planning commission. A handful of land users have TDM requirements so far. The most successful one is the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus. It's been pretty successful throughout the nation, actually. And then there are a couple of other land users which have required it. So there's the Madison Area Technical College, the Moxie Hotel, the Archipelago Village, and most recently Madison Yards. A lot of these plans have been relatively weak and unclear because there is no standardized TDM requirements from the city currently. Developers often push back because they can point to a lot of other land uses which have no such requirements. And as you know, most of these plans have been asked to provide 30% non-SOV mode. There is again a lack of clarity in that because there's some kind of confusion of what it should really entail. So and just to also look at this point that a lot of the plans have been required along the BRT corridor. So a point in consideration here might be that when a TOD overlay zone is also in the pipeline, so development that is happening along this corridor it might be better to have TDM relaxation here to impose fewer burdens and encourage development. So that would be a point that we can discuss at the end. So just coming to why we need a citywide TDM ordinance to provide clarity and uniformity in requirements for the developers, and also to enable better administration and enforcement by the city. And this may possibly be replicated by the neighboring cities as well. And this would be aligned with the city plans. So the comprehensive plan states under strategy 5 about creation of TMAs and implementation of TDM strategies along high intensity development corridors. And the sustainable transportation plan also lists out 2 priority recommendations, which deal with TMAs and having a TDM initiative in place. One should also note here that the transportation plan actually mentions an employer-based TDM measures. And this is something we would be discussing, whether we should be focusing on an employer-based TDM or a land use-based TDM. So just coming to the elements, the TDM program can be seen in terms of 4 elementary aspects. So who it targets, what are the requirements, how is it implemented, and what is the feedback and enforcement mechanism? This is the first and foremost design question: which parties have to participate? So you can look at it in terms of land use-based TDM, which would be focusing on the developers. So the threshold for this is usually on the basis of size, or it could be on the basis of parking requirements. The employer-based TDM usually has a threshold on the basis of employees. So you're looking at, let's say, all the employees in the city with over 500 employees. And then a third way of doing it, which has been successfully done in Cambridge, is a parking-based TDM, where the target is actually the additional parking requirements that's happening in any development. And this is a method that can actually be used. It can actually be incorporated in both the land use and the employer-based TDM. So coming to the next question is, what do they have to do? There are 2 ways of defining TDM requirements. The first one would be meeting a measurable performance goal. And this is what has been done so far in Madison. We've had a non-SOV mode share target of 30%. A couple of other cities also have an SOV target, which is single occupancy vehicles. And then there are various other ways of having a target goal. So this could be by calculating VMT, average vehicle ridership, which is basically sort of like a ratio of the number of employees or residents as compared to the number of trips that are happening. And then another way, if you go by the parking route, then a target could be ratio of parking spaces to employees. And then the other way of having a TDM requirement is having a menu of measures and then a point target based on the measures. And these measures could range from easy to complicated, and they would have a proportional point weightage. So easy measures could be something simple, like having a bike locker or wayfinding signs to transit stations. And something more complicated would be funding new transit stops or building new bike ped connections. The third element is how would these responsibilities be met? So there are a couple of things that would come under this. First of all, the discussion would be having the TDM ordinance separate from the zoning ordinance, whether the TDM process would be a part of the site approval, or if it's in the case of employer TDM, then it would be in the case of business license renewal. And then finally, the central question of whether the TDM requirement would be met individually or via a bigger group, a TMA or a Transportation Management Association. And then if you have a TMA, would the TMA be established as a whole for the city, or would it be established geographically, like multiple TMAs? Finally, the fourth aspect, which is something that can be discussed later in more detail once the program is really finalized, would be the monitoring and enforcement mechanism. So there are various considerations under this. Reporting mechanism. So with the target parties, would they be annually providing a report or just some kind of confirmation that they're doing it? How would the program be monitored and enforced? So would there be separate staffing? Would there be a private contractor at the city level who's managing it? And then finally, what happens in case of non-compliance? What kind of measures can you take? Would there be fines or some kind of administrative penalty. So now just giving a couple of examples of what some other cities have been doing. So starting with Arlington, this is a well-established and successful model for a land-use-based TDM approach. And it targets large residential and commercial projects. As you can see, they have a pretty low SOV rate already because of this really long going program. So Arlington, the responsible party is the building owner. Responsibility runs with the land, and the strategies have to be laid out as site plan conditions. And part of it is kind of being done in Madison already. The strategies are tailored to address the transportation impacts of the project, and this is just a sample of a matrix of measures that they have. So this is a menu of measures that they provide, which developers have to choose from. And these are just example of two aspects, ride sharing and parking, and they have a whole large set of other measures. And one interesting point here is that they have a citywide private contractor who actually helps with the entire management of the program. And there is also an agency under the transportation division which works along with a private contractor. The second example is Cambridge, which is primarily parking based. So the trigger here for TDM is when a non-residential property proposes to add parking. And if you look at this table here, they have two ways of sort of, applying the rules. So if there are fewer number of parking spaces required, they have the requirement of a small plan, which for which they only need to have 3 TDM measures. And these are some of the TDM measures that they need to choose from. If the number of parking spaces required are 20 or more, they need to provide a much more comprehensive plan. And that's when they have a goal. So they have a performance target, which is 10% SOV mode share reduction below the average census tract rate. And then, of course, they need to have more comprehensive set of measures, more measures, and then annual reporting. This is an approach that could be incorporated in both employer or land use-based programs once we decide that. An example here, San Francisco uses both land use and parking. This might seem to be an ideal way of looking at things. What they do is they have a predetermined way of categorizing land uses, which is based on the number of vehicle trips per parking space. And then this is a much more comprehensive program. They seem to target almost all new developments that are happening. And all the new parking spaces are given a point weighted. So the more parking you have, the more points you need to cover in your plan. And they have this whole comprehensive set of 26 TDM measures. So they don't have any performance target such as VMT reduction or SOV mode share. They just need to meet the total point target based on these measures. How they bring in VMT is that these measures have been already given weightage based on academic research, which showed how efficient is each measure in reducing VMT. So the work was actually done by the planning department in figuring out how effective each of these measures are. And all of this program is mostly managed by the planning department. And then I just give you 2 examples of employer-based TDM programs. It's been done in Seattle and Santa Monica. What should be noted here is that both these cities, which are doing employer TDM programs, are also having a separate program focusing on developers. So they sort of have a hybrid model. Seattle targets businesses with over 100 employees who work on a single site. And then each of the employers have to choose two TDM strategies from 3 categories. One of the categories is specifically parking. And then their target is to reduce the SOV rate, which they have established geographically instead of having a citywide rate. So if you can see, downtown has the lowest SOV rate, which is just 20%. And then they have to have commuter surveys, annual report submission, and then they have a separate transportation management program for commercial developments. Similarly, Santa Monica looks at both employers and developers. They have, again, classified the size of employers, and then based on that, they have to have a number of measures. So the smaller employers just have to have a very simple worksite transportation plan that just lists out some basic measures. The bigger employers, they have a much lower threshold. So their threshold is 30 as compared to Seattle's 100. And then they have to have a much more comprehensive listing, 5 market strategies, 5 basic support strategies, and 5 sort of direct transit and alternative transportation strategies. This is just sort of highlights of a discussion that we had with the city attorney on the legality of various considerations. So a citywide TDM ordinance that could be separate from the zoning ordinance is allowed. TDM requirements may be set by location, size, use, or parking capacity. That's all legally allowed. Land use versus employee trigger can both be used. A menu of TDM measures can be provided, and it's also legally allowed to ask for payment for TDM services as long as it is an option and not a mandatory form of tax. So this brings us to the discussion aspects. There are 2 key aspects to be discussed. The first is the purpose. So this is a draft purpose statement. The Madison TDM program primarily seeks to mitigate system-wide traffic, but also seeks to reduce negative localized traffic impacts from employment centers and new developments. And this is a question that we need to discuss, would be focusing on the employers or the land use. And as you can see, the draft purpose statement here is largely focusing on reducing VMT, which is focusing on reducing the car trips. And the second most central question for discussion is whom should these obligations be addressed? So employers or new land uses, which could be based on building permits, zoning map amendments, conditional use, or the third way of looking at it would be parking lots. Just to help with the discussion, I have some considerations for both land use based and employer based TDM on what we should be looking at. I'm happy to go through it, or if you're happy, I can quickly go through it. For a land use based TDM, we could focus on non-residential uses, which could be based, just to summarize again, which could be based on a size threshold or parking requirements. The advantage of a land use based TDM is that you can also include residential and mixed use developments, which might be hard to do in an employer based program. When looking at land use based TDM, you could focus on the new developments, the redevelopment happening, rezoning and conditional use. So the existing development would probably not be affected here. And a potential way of looking at it could be starting with only some specific non-residential uses and then scaling up. The thresholds could obviously be revised every couple years or as required. And then looking at the what aspect, developers would be the responsible party. The TDM requirements would run with the land. Of course, there would be variable TDM requirements based on the land use category and the size of development. And it could also be variable based on the geographic location. Many of measures could be assigned, or there could be a performance target, as we've already seen. The city staff would seem to feel, seems to feel that the menu of measures is a better way to go, but that could also be discussed. And of course, there should be special considerations for development in the DOD zone. The how aspect, again, these are questions that could be discussed later once the program is sort of detailed out further. One aspect to be looked at is that politically a land use based TDM might be easier because it would be targeting the new and the expanding development and not the existing development. And this could actually impact fewer properties and could take a longer time. When looking at the employer-based TDM, programmatically, it may be easier because it would include all the existing employers meeting the threshold within its ambit at once. That's definitely an advantage. And then, of course, Employers could be targeted on the basis of number of employees, establishment year, and parking requirements. So these are different ways of defining the threshold. Smaller employers might have the possibility of opting in, and we could start with a higher threshold to have a lower sort of catchment, just to kick it off. And then rest of the points are sort of similar. A menu of measures can be used for both employer or land use. So that's usable for both, and that can be decided once the target is decided. That's it for now. And then the next steps would be, of course, developing the timeline for how the ordinance will come through. Any other general comments? And then, of course, there are two aspects which need to be considered along with the TDM policy, which is the RP3 policy to complement the TDM program, because when you're sort of reducing parking requirements, there would be a spillover on street parking, which would need to be addressed. And then a TOD overlay zone is also in the pipeline along the east-west BRT corridor. So there might be a need for special considerations. Should you be leveraging the proximity to the BRT corridor in having a more aggressive TDM policy, or should it be the opposite? Should you be reducing the burden on development along the TOD? So these are just some of the considerations I would like to throw it open for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharui. That was outstanding. So I think the biggest charges, I think, for the board right now, at least in my mind, are really working on that purpose statement, and then talking about that responsible party. So are there questions for staff? Make sure you use the hand raise feature, because I can't necessarily see your image. Go ahead, Tom. Looks like you want to say something. Go ahead.
Yes, I do. Just a consideration, I think Shruvi in the last 3 slides put a little white box in the lower right-hand corner. Could you go back 3? Yeah, so if you go to the land-based TDM, she mentions politically it might be easiest because it targets new development. And most people that are trying to get their project approved are motivated to, fulfill requirements that allow them to get it approved, right? And most of the employer-based cities, such as like Santa Monica and then Seattle, also have land-based. So, with land-based TDM, it might be an easier first step just because there's a motivation by the developer to get something approved. And there's plenty of templates, that are available. The second one, true, you go to the second one. Employer-based TDM, Truby actually has just done an excellent job. It's more effective in that it might touch more people. There's about 300. Truby found that there are about 300 employers that have over 100 employees. But it might be a kind of an interesting thing to send a letter in the mail to an employer that employs 120 and say, we have new requirements for you. It might be just that process and that prior knowledge of the desire to reduce VMT. It just might be a more difficult step because the employers are not trying to get anything improved. They're just going about and then they get a letter in the mail saying there's a new requirement. So I guess I opinionize right there, and I'll mute myself for the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Tom. Can we go to that slide where it says discussion purpose, draft purpose statement? Just members of the board, thoughts on the purpose statement? Why don't we have discussion about that if there is any? Use the hand raise feature. How do people feel about the draft purpose statement? All right, there's one. Alder Foster, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, well, number one, I'm really supportive that we should be focusing on reducing VMT. I think that is really important. There's direct connection with improving safety associated with that as well. So, I mean, that to me makes sense as a broad goal. But the second half of this, it says also seeks to reduce negative localized traffic impacts from, and let's say new developments in this case. I think that was, well, I know that was the primary impetus behind all the developers drafting the MOPS resolution, and it's, I think there has been a strong desire to have something better in place so that when we're looking at proposals for redevelopment that will add density and that will add people and theoretically add trips, I think we're in a spot right now where, based on our high-level city goals, we want to support those kinds of developments. We don't want to require or bundle parking from sort of a city land use perspective, but then from a kind of neighbor perspective, it's often one of the primary concerns. And I'm having, there's a proposal in my district right now where this is kind of coming out again. So I guess I'm looking at that second half that says seeks to reduce negative localized traffic impacts. And I think, at least from sort of an Alder perspective, I'd like to figure out a way where a TDM plan as it relates to land use is actually giving at least comfort, if not something else beneficial to neighborhoods to accept these kinds of developments and support them. And so I don't know if we can strengthen that or go beyond just, reducing the negative traffic impacts, but it almost feels to me like there should be something coming along with, there should be some benefit, I guess, to the neighborhoods ideally as part of TDM for new developments, not just, we're going to make it not as bad as it could be otherwise. It's not a really great selling point to build support for it in the community. So I don't know if others have thoughts on that, but that just sticks out a little bit for me.
Thank you, Alder Foster. Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And in the program that we developed in LA, they had just that idea in mind. And so where it's to be specific about how it would work out, if there is some kind of exaction around a TDM program that, adds to new transit service or new bike ped facilities or something like that, they want that to be somewhere, not just go into a big pot for the city and end up across town, but be visible and usable within the neighborhood. So so in a purpose statement, I think it's a great point. I don't have a ready suggestion on how to reflect that in what, to flip this from a sort of a negative statement about we're not going to hurt you too much to we're going to bring some benefits, to focus benefits where the in the nexus of traffic or something like that. But that is really a very important part of that project design, program design that we worked on with LA. And so I don't know, maybe others will have some good wording to that effect if that's what we're going for.
Thank you, Eric. Alder Campbell, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for that. And thanks for all your work on this. It's a lot of work. But as I was listening to the presentation, I was thinking about, speaking of a lot of work, that it seemed like if and when we do a TDM ordinance, it's going to be a lot of work for our zoning staff and planning staff, which whichever way we go. And I found myself just sort of going off mentally about, are we really going to get the kind of gains we want in reduction of single occupancy vehicles by just, having a TDM ordinance? And just thinking about, kind of related to what Eric just said, I mean, what we really need to do is be able to increase taxes so we can build the kind of transportation infrastructure that will enable the behaviors we want to see in this city. And I don't know. I mean, that for me, when I start thinking about this and starting to work on issues like this, I get to a place of just really feeling a little bit of despair around that, because, like Eric said, if we're going to demand this of employers and developers, but we're not also providing the alternative to people riding in single occupancy vehicles, it just feels like, more government red tape. And I hate that I'm saying this, but I really want us, because I'm not that person. I'm not that alder. I'm not even, philosophically, like, government is good. And I'm in it for a reason. But boy, I think we need to really figure out how to raise the money to build the streets that we need for the kind of movement of people that we desire to have. So that's kind of just big picture thinking around this. But I also agree with Alder Foster that, former Alder Zellers and I, worked with you, Tom, and Heather in planning to come up with this MOPES idea. And it really was around how are we going to handle I think that the particular issue that really spurred this was apartment buildings in her district where the residents didn't want to pay $150 a month for parking and were paying $28 a year for on-street parking. And that was really the thing that kicked this whole thing off, was dealing, figuring out the RP3 program and how to make sure that people who are living in dense buildings aren't sort of spilling out their problems onto the streets. So I think that is something that I don't want to lose sight of in this. And I think that is something we can tackle, a little piece of this that we can tackle as we're figuring out the bigger pieces. But again, thank you, Cheruvi, for your work on this and for staff for bringing her in and putting this together.
Thank you, Alder Campbell. Oh, go ahead, Cheruvi, did you want to speak?
No, I just wanted to also thank Eric because he's been a huge support throughout.
Great. All right, Dave, your hand is up. Go ahead.
Just very quickly, responding to Alder Campbell's good point about thinking about how businesses are going to view this and maybe starting small. I would just urge you to continue to think about the geographic component of a TDM ordinance, if that's the direction you want to go, and how, a business out in American Center is going to have far different options, alternative transportation options available to them based on where they're located, based on where Metro's services are, very different than you would expect in, along the BRT corridor and Alder Zeller's District 2. If we are going to start with something small, that's part of going back to Madison in Motion, why we talked about transportation management associations and targeting those geographically where you have these pressures, as well as the alternative modes of transportation that are in place now. So that's something that I just urge you to think about as this goes forward.
Thank you, Dave. Tom Lynch, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to make a comment. Matt Tucker is online too, and so he may want to bat me down. But it's the approval of some of these developments takes a fair amount of staff time as it is. I can't tell you how many staff meetings there probably were regarding Madison Yards. And the fact that there's not really a clear-cut direction for developers is frustrating for them, and it takes our staff time as well. I think it will require more staff time, but there's something about structure that could be good for us and good for the developers. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Tom. Matt Tucker, go ahead. I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Just to follow up on what Tom mentioned, one thing to keep in mind is a lot of the projects that come through our across our desk will just say, never see the light of day at a board, committee, or commission. A lot of the employment projects, they're permitted uses. And I think part of the problems or the sort of the stress we've had with doing everything ad hoc is there isn't any predictability. We're not necessarily catching all of the land uses that we might want to catch if we put a policy like this forward. And ideally, the way that would be the most predictable and probably the most fair would be to find that line of these are the people that are the businesses that need to be involved in the program, and where they could open up a worksheet and clearly see what they need to do to comply versus going to a board, committee, or commission where they just never know what they're going to get as an outcome. But point being that probably about half of the work that we do here that my office sees never goes to a board, committee, or commission. Something to keep in mind.
Thank you, Matt. Chris McCahill, you're up next.
Thanks. I think I wanted to respond to Alder Kimball's comment a little bit. I think it's a good point that the point of trying to put this on the developers at the same time that we're trying to provide the transportation options that would let this happen at scale. I think I've heard the same thing from a lot of developers too, that it takes more transit, it takes more investments and things. But I think another part of the picture is that what we get in the meantime is a lot of these developments happening on the fringe with lots of parking, and then later we have to try and figure out how to accommodate them by running transit to the places that have designed around driving mainly. So I think a program like this, I think especially when parking is at the core, and it is in pretty much all these programs in one way or another. In Cambridge, it's the trigger. In San Francisco, you can get a lot of points for reducing parking. And with this sort of menu of options, basically this lets developers decide, how do they want to achieve this TDM plan on a site-by-site basis. So maybe just by, we can reduce parking, and we hadn't thought about that, and that's going to get us a lot of our points, and that's good in the long run. Or maybe it's just putting some money into a TDM fund or something. But it also affects development decisions. So if one of the criteria is to provide less parking and do all these bike accommodations and everything, I think that in itself is an incentive to locate in places where that's more realistic. So I think not only does this have the potential to affect the development on a site-by-site basis, but those bigger decisions about where development happens. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you, Chris. Alder Foster, you're up next.
Thanks. I wanted to reinforce what Dave Trowbridge said about thinking geographically. I think both in terms of the land use or the kind of workforce component. I'm thinking back to some of the work that happened in relation to the Madison Motion Plan in kind of dividing up the city and looking at existing mode share in different areas of the city. And I think it feels like we really do need to have different options and incentives kind of tailored for encouraging employers or residential development along a BRT corridor where, we would expect to not need to have a lot of parking, but we'd also maybe want them to support our transit system to be able to build there versus someone who's looking at land that is on the outskirts where we don't have BRT access and we're not going to have it for a long time. What do we want to see out there? And it feels like, I think the menu sort of design can accommodate that, but I also think it would be helpful for us, for staff, for the policy and planning board to be thinking about our city in different zones in that way. And while I don't think having targets and metrics is a useful way for developers, for example, I think, setting targets that we're going to check in several years. And when the developer is doing their project, that's our opportunity to get what we want, I think, to happen. So a menu and a point system works well there, but I think for us as a city, again, staff and policymakers, I think we should have some targets in mind, and those targets should be geographical in nature, right? We can have a citywide goal of reducing single occupancy vehicle to X%, but in order to get there, we should have a different goal for the downtown or the isthmus as opposed to the far east or far west side. So I think there's work there. I'm not sure how that comes into the actual VMT program that we develop, but maybe perhaps that menu, again, maybe that by having different options, some options will work in certain locations versus other. But I think we do need to think. I agree with Dave. We do need to think about the city in kind of different areas because we're going to expect things differently there.
Thank you, Alder Foster. Any further questions or I guess discussion at this point? Eric, go ahead.
So just to try to get consensus on the two questions, the two discussion questions, Grant raised the issue of trying to reframe that second part of the purpose statement, and we discussed that a little bit. I think maybe if silence is assent, and if everybody's happy with that, we can, I'm sorry, that's a phone in another room that I can't get to. Not my phone. It'll stop in a second. We can work with that and try to come back with a wordsmith version that takes into account that concept. How about the idea of employer versus land use? It sounds like the bulk of the conversation, if everybody's really on board with making it a land use based program and nobody's really excited about the employer based one, then we can let that go. So I guess that would be a question for folks. I think that's the way things were going, but I don't want to if somebody thinks employer based would be great, then I don't want to foreclose that.
Thank you, Eric. Does anyone have comments regarding that? That was my kind of take as well, listening to the conversation. Okay. Alder Foster, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess, I like being able to consider both. I sort of assumed it was, where do we focus right now? What do we prioritize? And so, yeah, like land use is the one that's on people's minds, but I don't know if that kind of direction then closes the door on considering employee-based as well. It looked like a number of cities do both. I guess I'm not sure what the implications of saying, yeah, those are both strategies we should be pursuing.
Does anyone have staff have a comment on that, or we could prioritize one over another? Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I just think that doing both is going to be maybe the straw that breaks the camel's back in terms of the effort. It's going to be complicated enough to do one or the other, politically and technically. So I suppose the direction could be work on a land use program, and we'll keep, thinking about employers in our back pocket. But since we're not doing either one now, I think our chances of success are much better if we focus on one or the other.
Go ahead, Matt Tucker.
So a couple of things really quick about the land use based, or just the program in general to get started. We thought too that there might be people that would want to option in to buy the services to voluntarily participate in the program, because when we were talking about this, we recognized there are a number of incentives. Somebody that could run a bus pass program, somebody could help connect people to bike share type things. There's just a lot of positives by having someone, a party wish to opt in. And then when you're dealing with just a land use based program, you'll be dealing with a point in time moving forward, as Sharuvi showed in her presentation. So you'll only be picking up those that come in at a point when the ordinance is in place, and then any new or some side of a threshold of expansion, they would need to participate. So it's a sort of like turning the faucet on, and it starts at a very slow drip, but eventually you would probably get enough of a steady stream to make some kind of an impact. It's just going to take a lot longer. Those places that exist that you might have wanted to capture will be non-conforming. They'll be legal non-conforming, meaning they won't have to comply with the requirement, particularly if it was something that was found in the zoning ordinance. There's some pretty tight law that relates to establishing rules after establishments are in place that affect the ability for zoning to be applying retroactively. So if it's something that is a hybrid, it might belong in another place of Madison General Ordinance, so you don't get stuck in the non-conforming situation.
Thank you, Matt. Margaret, go ahead. You had your hand up. I think it might have accidentally lowered it.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I just have a question for Eric or anyone else. I guess I'm not really clear on which approach, employer versus land use base, has the potential to have the largest impact in the shortest amount of time.
Well, literally you could turn on the employer one and touch all employers tomorrow, or whenever it turns, and that would be a lot of impact on day one, whether that might create some kind of backlash. You'd have to think about that. On the other hand, over time, the land use approach would be touching land uses, residential land uses, commercial, institutional, a variety of land uses that you wouldn't get at all with an employer-based approach. So, potentially over time, you're doing more with the land use approach. Maybe Cherubi, I don't know, do you agree with that? Is that a good summary?
Yeah.
Chris McCahill, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Just, I think to that point, I think it's a good question about which one could have the faster impact, but I think just the nature of this challenge of reducing VMT across the city to meet ambitious goals that we have is not something that will happen fast. So I think it's not having something in place that reshapes development moving forward, I think is very important. And this is not a fast process. But I think what Matt Tucker was saying is something I was thinking is that just creating this program, even if it is land use based, creates the infrastructure for things like TMAs, and then those exist, and then people can start tapping into that. pretty quickly.
Thank you, Chris. Go ahead, Matt Tucker.
Also, there's a place to start, and then one thing to think about is a few years down the road, an ordinance could be amended when we learn how it's working or not working. Good example of that would be the ordinance we did dealing with Airbnb type short-term rentals recently, where it was implemented in 2013 and spent some years learning about it and did some significant modifications just recently this year. So that's something to keep in mind. Get started with something and then modify a few years down the road.
Thank you, Matt. Robert, go ahead.
Question is one of the things that I think I understood is that it's if the land use or let's say that's the parking is set at a certain level now, and somebody wants to increase parking, for instance, they have 15 parking spots and they want to go to 25 spots. That's one of the things that might trigger the TDM. But then somebody else who has a different property already has 100 parking spots, let's say, because it's just a monstrous building of some sort. And at some point they sell their business and it gets kind of refurbished. Is the 100 parking spots or whatever, is that grandfathered in no matter, how this thing is redeveloped, or does that also give us a chance from a land use thing to say, well, you know what, once you completely turn what was there into something else, you're reset back to a lower level, and if you're going from 100 even down to 80, that's still 80. It's not it's to put people on a similar footing, in the future. Is it only when they add spots or add something that this can kick in? And I'm not really I'm probably not asking the question right, but hopefully somebody can help me understand this a little bit better.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I think the answer is maybe. I hate to be vague in it, but it all depends on how the words are written. We do have requirements in the ordinance and the zoning ordinance already that say when you exceed a certain threshold, when you add 50% expansion to a building requires compliance with requirements. When you're adding some other use, or if you're changing the use, sometimes you go from a use that is like a more of an industrial use to more of an office type of use, and change of use can be something that would trigger the requirement, not necessarily even a physical change to the site.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any further questions or discussion? Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Just want to make one more point on something that seemed to be a question in the presentation, which was the idea of what to have to do with the TOD overlays. And I think this is a tricky one to figure out because obviously we want to incentivize development in these TOD areas. I hope that the way that the TDM menu is structured does that, accomplishes that. And one of my concerns would be loosening those restrictions for folks in TOD areas. I'd be concerned doing that too much. I think, you could count high quality transit access as one of a good chunk of the TDM plan or program or whatever. But we've already seen in Madison Yards that developers might lean on that as sort of the main mechanism that will lower VMT, and then not do other things like looking at parking and bike share and stuff like that. So just my thought there.
Thank you, Chris. Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, a great thought. And Just to fill in at least a way a little bit of the conversation has been going in this work group is at some point we'll need to have a discussion about the overlay district that Cheruvi mentioned, but the overlay district will do some of that. So the overlay district likely will forbid certain auto-oriented land uses within, say, a quarter mile of the stops. It may also have lower parking maximums, some density bonuses for certain things. So it's possible that the incentives and carrots and sticks both that we want in terms of shaping development around the BRT stations all gets contained in that. And that lives alongside the TDM program, and the TDM works for everything outside. But definitely tailoring it is part of the conversation, and where that all ends up within the code is still not 100% clear that the TDM ordinance is a Section 28 thing or not. But point well taken. But that's kind of where we've been going with it.
All right. Thank you, Eric. Further comments, questions, or discussion? So how would we like to leave this evening? It sounded like we want to come back. Members would like to come back having worked on or thought about that purpose statement a little bit more. So perhaps we want to see this at a future meeting, either yet this month on our 15th or in August. The other thing, do we want to give that guidance officially to work on a land use program, having an emphasis there? Thoughts? Staff, you can feel free to chime in too if there's something that you'd like to leave this meeting with from us.
Yeah, so
go ahead.
We have Cheruvi for maybe a month, maybe not even a month, right? She's actually done really a phenomenal amount of work. And she will provide some memos, but we don't want this to be an effort that stagnates. We would like to keep this moving, and I think we also have some help from SSTI as well. But if I am hearing that there'd be, in the purpose statement, there'd like to be a little bit more strengthening of reducing or eliminating negative impacts, because that was perhaps the thing that initially prompted the MOPS resolution. It seems like there's a little bit of a leaning towards what would a land use look like? I think that's not inappropriate, because the places that have employment also have land use. So we could just at least investigate what would land use look like here. What would the structure be? And I'm going to play Eric and Chris off each other. And so Eric always says the best TDM is located in the right place. Okay? And Chris says, yeah, but if you locate in the right place, doesn't mean you get a free ride, right? And so I think the idea is that we have to understand how this TDM ordinance would interact with the TOD overlay. So those are the three things that I got from the discussion. And did I correctly interpret them?
I have a hand up. Alder Foster, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, Tom, you captured a lot of what I heard as well. I think the only kind of meta input I would give is I think this was a tough discussion element for the board. I think it's really technical. It's really complicated. We got a great sort of introduction to. I think it's a lot for a lot of us to just sort of fully understand. And so I think to the degree that we could get this topic coming back to us more often and in sort of smaller chunks and with kind of real, specific sort of asks, I think we'll probably be able to provide a little bit better feedback moving forward that way. And also just in the spirit of, action plan, making these things happen. I think also just getting kind of a short list of here's some things that we could do sort of sooner versus later. I think Alder Kemble mentioned the RP3 program. I mean, that's been on the list forever, and that's something we can even just start with, absent a full TDM program, for example. So I think that would be a great thing for me personally, and kind of next time you come is have some, sort of specific things we could be working on based on the feedback you heard today.
Yeah. We did separate the RP3 RPO from some of the stuff that Cherubi was working on, primarily because Sabrina feels like she felt like she had the capability and the capacity within her staff to kind of go from RP3 to RPO and lead, or at least shepherd that process through the board. That's why we asked Cherubi to focus on TOD, which you actually haven't even seen the work that she's done with TOD, and also then TDM. So, but I agree, and these are discussions that we could have over the next 6 months.
Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, just in the spirit of keeping it moving, I would like to bring back the purpose statement to the next meeting. I know that I don't know what else is on the agenda, but like to just have a hopefully quick follow-up discussion and get that out of the way, if that's, unless anybody objects.
That sounds good. We'll talk about that on our next item then for future agenda meeting items. All right, any further comments, questions, discussion, thoughts people have on where we are with this? Are we feeling okay? Sounds like we'll be seeing at least the purpose statement at our next meeting, and then we'll be getting more updates and opportunities to provide input going forward. All right, seeing none, we'll move on to the next item, which is Registrar 61175, our future meeting schedule and agenda items. We are scheduled to meet. We are meeting on July 15th. I think that's next Wednesday. Items I have for papers in order here. That meeting, potential items, I should say, are Transportation Commission ordinance draft, discussion of the relationship between the Transportation Commission, the Board of Public Works, and the Transportation Policy and Planning Board. Just an overview of the DOT budget request for next year, Wilson Street corridor, and then a review or looking at this purpose statement again, as Eric just mentioned. So that's what I have. Any questions, comments, discussion? Alder Foster?
Yeah, this might already be known, but it's showing that meeting is canceled in Legistar, so it'd be good to get that updated.
Okay. Yeah,
And just a note too, that I requested the meeting, but I haven't received a response back. And I know that I think it was at the last council meeting, there wasn't like these meetings can occur, but I still have been relying on the mayor's office to coordinate the technical capacity. So I just haven't received a response back yet on that.
You could probably contact IT directly about that.
Yeah.
I know that's what a lot of other committee staff have been doing.
Are they? Okay. So maybe I'll talk with Joe. So,
yeah.
Who's our tech facilitator today? It's Jesse.
Jesse, yes.
So
stand by on that then. But the intent is to have the meeting on the 15th. Alder Foster, I still have your hand up. Not sure if it's from before. Okay. Further comments on that? Questions? All right, seeing none. General announcements by the chair. The only thing I have is we did pick a date today for the first meeting of the joint the traffic calming subcommittee with TPBB members and TC members, and that will be a week from today on the 13th. So that is moving forward. That's all I have for general announcements. Any questions? Go ahead, Eric.
Not a question, but if I may, just another little announcement that Planning Commission last week passed the Oscar Mayer plan, but fairly narrowly after a very It's very similar discussion to what we had at TPPB, where the two issues at hand were the Coolidge Street intersection and the size of the Hartmeyer wetland. And it's coming to City Council July 21st. So if you have an interest, you may want to weigh in then. We did get, did hear from, say, Sustainable Madison committee members, and I think that's always welcome. I can imagine that alders would welcome hearing from us. So,
all right, thank you, Eric. Anyone have anything else? Now is a good opportunity if you have anything you'd like to announce or say. All right, that's all we have for the evening. Looking for a motion.
Move adjournment.
Move Alder Foster, seconded by Alder Kemble. All those in favor of adjournment say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. We're adjourned. Enjoy the evening.